welcome to Doctor Who 50 years ago, the show that looks back to the episode that aired in 1970 and looks at the differences between then and now. This week, the final episode of Spearhead from Space, episode 4. It comes with a free ticket to Madame Tussauds, if you can stomach it. Disclaimer, this podcast does not. Please don't try and reclaim it. I am Ben.
I am Luke.
And I am Nick.
And here we are, and here we go into the news from 1970. On Sunday, the 18th of January, a group calling themselves the Environmental Teach-In Incorporated take out a full-page advert in the New York Times, citing April the 22nd as Earth Day and preparing for the first US nationwide event to call attention to the ecology crisis. As we will see throughout the 1970s, the world becomes apparent that filthy oil and human consumption is laying waste to the planet.
Right, so what I quite like about this is that in the 60s you had a ragtag group of environmentalists who weren't really coordinated. You didn't really have anyone. And then there was a senator from Wisconsin who hilariously was named Gaylord Nelson, and he was the one who brought all of these groups together, and he was the one who devised the strategy for the teach-ins. But he got all these people together, and he mostly got activists and young people. So I do actually quite like this divide between we hate the government and we're going to do things our own way, and then it's the government that brings them together in a strange sense.
Mainly by continuing the status quo.
Well, I suppose there is that, yes.
I'm pretty sure we can draw comparisons between 50 years ago and now. This matter. Lovely. Except it isn't, because it's horrible. Keep Britain tidy, I guess. On Wednesday, the 21st of January, the Iraqi government suppressed an attempted coup and arrested, convicted, and executed up to 40 people. I feel duty-bound to talk about this because this shows how governments demonstrate their power, slightly effectively, and how bloody the Middle East can be 50 years ago and now.
Yeah, we should say at time of recording, it's been kicking off in Iraq and Iran with the plane potentially being shot down by a missile, and obviously the American bases got bombarded a couple of days ago. So yeah, Iraq's always been a fun place, hasn't it? The last 50 years.
All because of its connections or near enoughness to Russia, although
it's a geostrategic location, with it being right in the middle. It's near Russia, it's near Iran, it's near Saudi Arabia, it's near Israel. So
so add a healthy dose of ethnic and religious tension, and it's quite the boiling pot.
Yes,
it's a tricky crisis, and one that will not go away in the short term. So there.
Yes, hopefully by the time that this goes out, it will have cooled off a bit. Fingers crossed.
But that's humanity for you. And finally, on Friday the 23rd of January, Australis Oscar 5, the first amateur radio satellite controlled from the ground, was launched in, I guess, Australia. And the point I'm going to make here is that it shows any old fool can launch a satellite into space with either good or bad intentions, and this has continued 50 years on.
Yes. Don't you work for a former amateur radio company, Luke?
I theoretically could, yes. Well, I'll point out that this wasn't your average Joe sending this into space. They were students, so they probably had access to some pretty high-tech kind of stuff.
It's probably a case of what's the main reason to go out into space? And in the 1970s, It's just show off. And we
Yeah, we
could
haven't got
argue
to
that in the 2020s, it's still that case.
yeah, yeah,
And
certain
now that the
companies.
final frontier has been conquered. Go ahead, Nick.
No, certain companies certainly like to show off putting things into space, don't they?
I'm sure its windscreen will break on re-entry. That's quite enough of that. That was the news. And now we shall get into Spearhead from Space, Episode 4, aired the 24th of January 1970. The dynamite that is alien invasion explodes, and it's glorious. Innocent civilians die, he said with a bloodlust he didn't expect to have, and the real horror of facsimiles taking over governments and governmental positions is executed, albeit slightly poorly in my view. It's still a satisfying conclusion.
Well, it doesn't really go as far as it theoretically could do, but I I think it is quite good that it doesn't go as far, because otherwise you get sort of bizarre event television crammed into 23 minutes at the end of what's been happening so far, and it would just get too cramped. If the Brigadier called up the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary was a plastic facsimile as well, it's taken the idea too far. I quite like that it's staying small scale.
Well, making it small scale so it keeps it more relatable. Like the people on the street, like that guy on the bike that gets shot. It feels that could be you. You could be on that street because that looks like a high street that could be in any town. Doesn't have to be in a city.
Yeah, because I was also rewatching for entirely personal pleasure Quatermass 2, of course, which we have previously mentioned in previous episodes, is slightly connected or a possible facsimile, or rather Spearhead from Space is the facsimile of Quatermass 2. Thanks very much for laughing. It's very helpful. And it does insinuate that the Prime Minister was taken over by the aliens in that one. So, but the ending of Quatermass 2 is a bit naff. So maybe Robert Holmes had the great idea there to keep it simple and keep it fearful, but not too fearful. Let's see how Robert Holmes concludes this episode in a bit more detail, shall we? So, General Scobie's facsimile takes him, and his Auton replica cancels the Briggs investigation of the plastics factory. The Doctor attempts to communicate with the meteorite and establishes it's part of a collective intelligence, but then goes to Madame Tussauds because it's a waxworks. There's a flattering version of Nixon and many top civil servants. It's Americanized, politicized, and there aren't many celebrities, as Liz says. It says a lot about this tourist attraction, I feel.
What drew my attention in this bit was when the Doctor's holding his head over real Scobie, and then he says there's a wristwatch on him, and it's all properly wound up. And I thought he was checking for a heartbeat, and in that moment, I pictured how Moffat would do this, right? So in
Praise
Moffat...
be? Question mark?
Well, we'll see. So if it was Moffat, they would all be the real people, and they'd be like scarred, or they'd all be like the facsimiles. Well, they are, except Scobie. But the point is that you would end up having like a line that's like a soundbite, and I wrote it down. Why would you make a mannequin with a heartbeat? And then the camera would dolly in on Bill or Liz Shaw in this case, and spooky music would start playing. And I was thinking about how this kind of represents how we're more attuned to trailers and sound bites, and in particular quotes now. You know, you're much more likely to be able to quote something if you've seen it 4 times. If you've seen it once, that don't happen.
Yes, but then I would argue that media today has a plethora of weapons in its arsenal to drill these quote unquote earth shattering things into your mind.
Well, certainly, I mean, when you look at the trailers that you get on the DVDs, you know, the trailers back then were just a scene, weren't they? They weren't highly edited like they are now. When you're talking about making a trailer, kind of like bait scene, the one that sticks out to me the most of recent times is it was in Under the Lake, I think. The doctor says he wants to kiss it to death or something.
Oh, yes.
That line is so out of place in that particular scene.
I think it's so out of place from reality, but go on.
Yeah, but it's so nice that you don't get things like that. It takes its time and it's not bothered with trailer bait or.
As we've said, General Scobie's waxwork has a working watch, which insinuates he's the real person, frozen in time or something. The Doctor and Liz stay in overnight, whilst the creepy man in the suit Channing is preparing to take back the meteorite using replica Scobie. So when they are all gathered, they can create a NesTENe consciousness. Channing goes to close Madame Tussauds and activates the replica civil servants, ready to presumably kill the others and take over the government, whilst the Doctor attempts to persuade the mind-controlled Hibbert to rebel. And that's a slow burner, building up to an inevitable conclusion, which I guess is good storytelling.
There's a point in here where Channing says that he's sensing an alien life form, and it's something about that which is really changing my view of the whole serial. So I really want to save that bit for my sort of closing verdict.
Ooh, that's intriguing.
Yes, you're keeping us on tenterhooks.
Having obtained the meteorite, the NesTENe consciousness is formed and ready to invade, and does so. Its autons come into life in an expensive clothes shop near you. 72 shillings? Caw. A massacre in colour ensues whilst the Doctor makes a weapon to cancel the NesTENe consciousness's signals to the autons. Hibbert tries and fails to attack/rebel, and he's killed with total destruction. It's iconic.
Yeah, it's basically a perfect scene. And what I find interesting is the first victim of the Auton that we see in the massacre is a policeman who's shot in broad daylight, really to drive home the fact that no one's safe. The police can't protect you.
It's Robert Holmes kissing goodbye to the last vestiges of his former life.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And take that.
Yeah, and then also we get Hibbert being killed. Again, he's the only other person to get total destruction to, and we've already said last week that kind of links it to being the left purging itself sort of thing of any traitors. And
even though he was offered the "you'll be spared, you helped us."
Yeah, and what's notable here is that Channing, for the most part, is quite unemotional, but here he does, when he kills Hibbert, he orders max total destruction. He looks angry. There's something in his eyes that's just quite interesting. Again, I think really furthers this whole. I think it is meant to be representative of a purge.
Yeah. You know, for Hibbert, read Long Bailey or something.
Ooh.
You're welcome. Carry on.
And the NesTENe gets a 10 out of 10.
Oh, I'm going to leave teeth marks in the hand that I'm biting.
What I like about the Autons in this episode compared to last episode, in the last episode they were moving like humans. Now they are moving a lot more slowly and patiently, as opposed to running around like they were last time. And it's kind of bridging that gap between the modern version and a lot of the other kind of robots that you got around that this sort of time as well, kind of how the Cybermen are also that slow, patient, and they kept coming kind of thing.
The Briggs forces raid the plastics factory, find the replica Scobie, whom the Doctor kills with a microphone-esque weapon. A battle ensues whilst the Doctor and Liz have a showdown with Channing and the NesTENe consciousness, which is a giant cephalopod, because that's the best form to take over the Earth, apparently. The Doctor is strangled a bit with a few tentacles, and it's up to Liz to fix his wretched machine, destroy the NesTENes, and save the world. Which is brilliant.
What? Yeah. Is it brilliant?
This is definitely... Oh,
well, I mean, it's the fact that the Doctor's completely useless, and it's actually the companion being useful, which is something we didn't normally get in 60s Who.
there is that. Although the climax of the story is, Liz, make sure you push the right button to send out the right radio wave. Doctor, I can't push the button right to send out the right radio wave. Ah, I'm being strangled by a tentacle. Okay, it's fine. You sent out the right radio wave.
At least she does fix it herself, though. She does like play around with the wires. So
Compared to the heel face turn of Holmes' sequel,
Yeah.
she's at least more useful than Joe Grant.
or instant master betrayal.
There are biros in Doctor Who more useful than Joe Grant. But I do quite like how the answer is found in boring science, and how it's selecting the right frequency at the end, done with some proper uninterestingness, and I like that realism.
Yeah, no, it's a realistic machine, and that's why, or well, I say realistic, but I mean at least it has physics properties that not Joe Grant.
Scientifically grounded.
Yes, scientifically grounded that Liz understands, as a modern day physicist. So it's continuing this grounded science approach, and I think in the next scene they mention it was like an ECT machine, electroconvulsive therapy, isn't that what they say?
Yep.
So it's nice that the technobabble is a real thing. So it's quite nice that they're using an analogy to something that's modern day viewers would have known about, rather than some wishy-washy, futuristic sounding technobabble.
Kit Pedler would be proud, probably. Having saved the world and made the possibility of a sequel, but being unable to leave the Earth, the Doctor is roped to join UNIT permanently whilst he can work on his TARDIS, under the alias of John Smith, with Liz working with him in tow, and maybe a car too. That completes the Doctor's introduction, the setup of Season 7, with its sci-fi realism, and the archetype invasion of Earth story. And Robert Holmes does it all right. He's finally found his feet with this story, thank goodness, and would go on to write even better schlock, as we called it a few episodes ago, and also really good episodes too. Do you want to do your bit, Luke?
Okay, so my verdict on this story. When Channing says that he's sensing the alien life form, he's mystifying the Doctor, and he's making him deliberately more alien. And I made a list of stories before this that have deliberately tried to play up and make it part of the story or characterization that the Doctor is very alien. So we got An Unearthly Child, the weirder bits of the Sensorites that probably didn't know what it was doing, the Space Museum, the Celestial Toymaker, the big one, Power of the Daleks, the War Games, and to an extent the Gunfighters, just because the Doctor's a bit strange. But this is one where he actively doesn't want to be there, trying to separate himself from everyone around him, not really caring in anything except sort of the alien and the science. And setting that up, not only does it put an interesting new dynamic to the show that keeps it, at least for the moment, away from the whole UNIT family, which would very much come later, but we also have more of an idea of the Doctor in his canon, and it's trying more to define him using what's come beforehand, as opposed to the 60s, which was just making it up as it went along. And as we go into the Terrance Dicks era, which is just all made by one man, we actually can have the opportunity to solidify it properly. And I think that's a really big change from the 60s to the 70s.
So you could argue that the Doctor as a character can hear the past calling out to him and use it to make what he is, to butcher whatever on Earth was said in The Woman Who Fell to Earth.
Absolutely.
Lovely.
And so you mentioned this being the archetypal alien invasion of Earth story. I guess it's like this is sort of the episode where, so you've just mentioned, Luke, about this is where the Doctor from now on will be more like this than how he was depicted in the 60s, won't he? He's definitely an alien. He's definitely a Time Lord. He's definitely more like that. And then the alien invasion of Earth. There have been other invasions of Earth before this, haven't they? But not so much in the present day. And although there were obviously some before, but this is the one that I think everyone, like every other one after this, would more want to be like this story, wouldn't they? With that scene in the street.
As did a very young Russell T Davies.
Yeah, well, yeah. There's a reason why he picks basically this story and went with it having that street invasion as the entry point for new fans and beginning in the 21st century.
Yep, it is a trendsetter for characters and it is a trendsetter for storytelling, and Doctor Who has much to thank it for. And now, with thanks to the partwork series of Doctor Who The Complete History, thanks Wallet, how did this episode and story come to be? Well, Derek Sherwin, the outgoing producer, had piloted a new format in last season's The Invasion, which had introduced UNIT. He conceived Liz Shaw, and indeed for Quatermass-style serials would revitalise a decidedly tiring Season 6, which had played a part in Patrick Troughton, Fraser Hines and Wendy Padbury's departures. For the Doctor, Sherwin had wanted a comedic person, Ron Moody, or maybe even John the Measurer, but their second choice was ultimately John Pertwee, he of stage and radio comedies. Mervyn Haseman and Henry Lincoln, they of Brigadier copyright, get £5 an episode with the Brig In, something which kicks the show in the arse 50 years ago and now as he becomes a major character. Terence Dix, may his prolific soul rest forever in the BBC bar, had Robert Holmes on standby for this story. Holmes and Sherwin combined created the concept of the Autons, and thus was this story originally entitled Facsimile. That's why I've kept saying that word. Frightening and very well done, said the head of children's programmes, because Doctor Who was still ultimately in the charge of the children's programmes department of the BBC, and the show got a regular 8 million viewers. You can compare that to the figures of the opening of Series 12 of the revived show, which got 4.88 million viewers overnight, and we can now insert a comment about how good these viewing figures are for 2020 and the multi-digital platform that is media nowadays.
Although bear in mind that was on New Year's Day, where people are all hungover and might as well just flop down in front of the TV.
That concludes Spearhead from Space, which opens Season 7 of Doctor Who, which has a few differences and a few similarities between 50 years ago and now. It's got sci-fi and realism, it's got an alien from space with two hearts, and sometimes it's got Earth and terrifying alien invasions. And that's a bit of all right for me. Thank you very much for listening. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to iTunes. Leave positive comments there, it helps. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube, where you can like, comment and subscribe, and Google Plus, if that's still a thing, I don't know. We shall be back next week with the first episode of The Silurians. Yes, that's what it's called, be quiet. Until then, I've been Ben.
I've been Luke.
And I've been Nick.
But that's a lie, because I have been Doctor Who and the Ben.
I've been Doctor Who and the Luke.
And I've been Doctor Who and the Nick.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Okay, how tall is a space rocket?
What a question. Well, I mean, let's bring up one of Elon's.
It surely must be at least
Okay, the 1969 Apollo 11 rocket, how big was it?
Right, so Apollo 11. That's a space flight. Crewed lunar
Assassin
landing
5.
spacecraft itself. No, that's also
Assassin
lunar.
5 rocket.
Oh yes, Saturn V. Project cost height 110.6 meters.
Okay, then I would be able to say during the Ambassadors of Death, when the Doctor goes towards that rocket.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The Silurian, there's a dig site that goes down to the Silurian period, and that goes 66 meters into the ground. So when he goes up to the rocket, that's 110 meters above ground. So that's the furthest we get away from Earth in season 7. 110 meters.
But he goes into space.
Does he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, he goes into
Oh well.
space.
It was a nice thought.